Today we're going to be talking about the top 10 greatest players in Colts history. Now, the Colts are one of the oldest franchises in NFL history and have a lot of history from the 1960s and the 2000s especially, where they were one of the best franchises in NFL. And even outside of that, have had several great players. So there are going to be a lot of honorable mentions that don't end up making the list. Guys like Robert Mathis and Andrew Luck. But for the most part, I am pretty confident with this list that I made and guys who I think have cemented themselves as standing out amongst the pack, especially as you get higher up on the list. So without further ado, let's get started. At number 10, we're going to go with Dwight Freeny, a guy who I went back and forth on between him and Robert Mathis, and I swear to God, this was one of the hardest decisions I made. How do you choose between the all-time league leader in forced fumbles and one of the best defensive players of the 2000s? I ended up choosing Freeny because although Mathis hasn't beaten every defensive stat for the Colts, Freeny's not far behind, and Mathis did play much longer with the team, having played with the Colts his entire career. In spite of this, Freeny was the better defensive player, having played at the same time period as Mathis with far more dominance. Freeny was a 7-time Pro Bowler and a 3-time first-team All-Pro selection, and he finished as the Defensive Player of the Year finalist twice in his career, having 6 double-digit sack seasons, including a 2004 campaign where he led the league in sacks and made a name as one of the most versatile edge rushers in the game, being able to play anywhere from a 3-4 outside linebacker to a 3 technique to even a 4-3 defensive tackle, which is pretty impressive for someone who only weighed 270 pounds. At number 9, let's go with Reggie Wayne. Now, Reggie Wayne is someone who I feel was overshadowed by better players who played around him, as well as being the victim of playing in one of the most competitive and deep eras of the wide receiver position in NFL history. But he also was that guy. Wayne played his entire career with the Colts, and even as a 34-year-old, helped a rookie Andrew Luck make a name for himself in the league, putting up 1,300 plus receiving yards in 2012, proving that he was not just good because of Peyton Manning and being a complementary piece to Marvin Harrison. Even before, Wayne had shown that he was very much capable of being a number 1 receiver throughout the majority of the late 2000s, where he posted 1,200 plus yards in 4 of 5 seasons while remaining an NFL Ironman, snapping up for every game for 11 straight seasons. It was during those 11 seasons where Wayne was a 6-time Pro Bowler and led the league in receiving yards, in fact, once back in 2007, while showing to be capable of playing any type of receiver role, whether that was a slot, X receiver, Z receiver, or any type of gadget role that the Colts wanted him to play. But regardless of how underrated I think Reggie Wayne is, the Colts franchise has just had a lot of guys who have been just as, if not more dominant at their respective position. So I cannot put Wayne any higher than number 9. Number 8 is going to be one of the best receivers of his time period, and although he played in the pre-Super Bowl era, he was so transcendent for his time in impacting the passing game, he just has to be this high, and that is Raymond Barry. Barry was the favorite target of Hall of Fame quarterback Johnny Unitas, as he led the league in receiving yards and receptions each 3 times from 1957 to 1960, as well as receiving touchdowns twice. Barry is one of the best deep threats in NFL history, especially at a time where most quarterbacks were still limited as far as how far that they could pass the ball. Barry's overall deep receiving game expanded a Colts offense to be one of the first modern passing attacks in NFL history, and combined with his explosive route running skills, Barry's dominance was impactful in changing how number 1 receivers were used, not just in the NFL, but the AFL as well. He impacted receivers such as Lance Alworth and Don Maynard long before the likes of Jerry Rice or any other deep ball receivers in the late 1980s and the early 90s. Barry finished his career as a 7-time Pro Bowler and a 5-time All-Pro, and has cemented himself as one of the greatest receivers in NFL history, even today. 7, give me John Mackey, another receiver who changed the game greatly, although Mackey was technically a tight end. But Mackey's receiving skills were the first example of a tight end being used effectively as something other than just a 6th blocker. Mackey was a fantastic deep threat for Johnny Unitas, as well as a fantastic checkdown option, but was also great at creating yards after the catch, and for that reason became a development in the Colts offense as a primary target in screen passes, both as a blocker and a receiver himself, revolutionizing how offenses looked at screen passes effectively, and really being the earliest version of someone like Travis Kelce today and what he does as far as being creative in the Chiefs offense. And Mackey's dominance was well documented, as even in just 10 seasons at a position that until today never really had great longevity, Mackey stood out. He averaged 16.5 or more receiving yards per reception in each of his first 4 seasons, while becoming a 5-time Pro Bowler and a 4-time All-Pro, and being a vital cog in the Colts' Super Bowl winning campaign, even past his prime down the line in 1970, cementing his legacy as one of the greatest tight ends in NFL history. At number 6, I'm going to be a little bit controversial here, but I'm going to go with Marvin Harrison. And I know a lot of you might think that he should be a lot higher on this list, but most of you might or might not know that I think Marvin Harrison is a little bit overrated. I mean, yeah, I think his numbers compared to the average all-time great receiver are, relatively speaking, pedestrian, and his yards were often a result of scheming and high-volume passing and playing with one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time in Peyton Manning, more than himself. Not to say that Harrison wouldn't have been good without Manning, but I don't think he would have been in top 5 comparisons. And that's where I stand on Harrison, even on this Colts list. First off, I don't think Harrison was nearly impactful to the game or the Colts franchise overall compared to some of these players on this list. But let's talk about the good things about Harrison. Harrison, even at his worst, stagnated around only about 800 yards each in his first 3 seasons before his production skyrocketed with Peyton Manning starting to get better. But once he did, Harrison was still better than the likes of Reggie Wayne and other Colts greats, as well as most receivers in what was probably the deepest era of wide receivers in NFL history. He was, at the end of the day, an 8-time Pro Bowler and an 8-time All-Pro who did lead the league in receiving yards twice and at one point had a single season record for most receptions. He still is one of the best route runners in NFL history, and no one can take any of that from him. That is still an all-time great career. But yeah, I cannot put him any higher than players who changed the game more, contributed more to more important eras of Colts history, did more as a Colt, or just were better than him. So yes, he comes in at number 6 on this list. At number 5, I'm going to go with Lenny Moore. Before Marshall Faulk and Christian McCaffrey, there was Gale Sayers and Roger Craig, and Lenny Moore walked so all of these guys could run. Moore was the first dual-threat running back and one of the first few halfbacks to truly become a weapon in his team's offense, which he was in more than one way. Moore was arguably a better receiver than he was even a running back, as he had close to about 800 receiving yards per season in an era where any running back catching the ball for the most part in any way was looked down upon. But make no mistake, Lenny Moore was also a really damn good running back. He led the league in yards per attempt 4 times in his career, and actually began his career leading the league in scrimmage yards per touch in 6 consecutive seasons, including a 1957 year where he led the league in scrimmage yards and still surprisingly did not get any consideration for the MVP award. In fact, Moore followed that up with even more scrimmage yards, continuing to 5 more seasons of 1,200 or more scrimmage yards, while also leading the league in scrimmage touchdowns twice in his career. Overall, Moore was a 5-time All-Pro and led the Colts to 2 Super Bowl championships and revolutionized the running back position, as well as being a critical piece to the Colts' earth-shattering offense that tormented the league for a decade. At number 4, we'll go with Jim Parker. Now, Parker is one of the most important offensive line in the history of the league, as well as one of the most versatile, being that he was both an elite tackle and an elite guard. Parker's dominance as a pass blocker while still being able to run into the second and third level as a run blocker for guys like Lenny Moore opened up new options for offensive coordinators on how to scheme offensive linemen, while also setting a new standard for how long offensive linemen needed to hold up in pass protection, which, remember, was still a developing art in the NFL at the time. Parker could play 4 or 5 positions on the line and was a 5-time All-Pro as a tackle, as well as a 3-time All-Pro as a guard. He is very much one of the best offensive line to ever play the position in NFL history, and for that reason, he comes in at number 4. At number 3 will be Gino Martti, a man who was a freak of nature while playing in the 1950s and the 1960s with the Colts. And if you wanted to make the argument that he was too good for the competition at the time, I wouldn't disagree with you, but I do think that because he was just so athletically gifted, that's why he was that dominant, and he was just way ahead of his time as far as pass rushing technique, to the point where I do think he would have been a dominant pass rusher even today. Martti was a 10-time All-Pro and a 7-time first-team All-Pro selection, and was one of the first few players to play as a true 3 technique, even as the NFL had yet to try out a 3-4 defense for another 20 years. Marchetti recorded 56 sacks in his final 5 seasons with the Colts and would have recorded a lot more throughout his career had the stat been officially recorded before 1960. Marchetti was an artist in the run game, known for contorting his body in such awkward ways to gain leverage on opposing linemen, and as a pass rusher, developed early stages of the swim, chop, club rip, and hump moves that became the trademark of some of the greatest defensive players in NFL history. Guys like Lawrence Taylor, Bruce Smith, John Randall, and Reggie White. Especially during the golden era of the 1980s and 1990s, his pass rushing moves proved to be a huge influence. And having helped the Colts to back-to-back championships in the 1950s, yes, Marchetti has cemented himself as not just one of the greatest Colts ever, but one of the greatest pass rushers of all time. At number 2, we're going to go with Johnny Unitas, a guy who we've already mentioned throughout this video by the means of mentioning his teammates and other players throughout his career. But yes, Unitas was that guy. He did revolutionize and change the modern passing game forever. Unitas was truly the first deep ball pocket passer of the modern age of the NFL as far as the passing attack goes, being someone who could call out his own plays at time if need be, or be able to just audible based on what the coach gave him, and being able to go through multiple reads and progressions and target different types of receivers, not just a deep ball receiver, not just go for the run game, but also be able to change and manipulate defenses accordingly, being able to hit a running back on a check down or on a wheel route, as he did with guys like Lenny Moore, or being able to hit John Mackey on a screen pass or put him on an island on his own as his own receiver. Unitas was a 10-time Pro Bowler and a 5-time first-team All-Pro selection in his career, winning 3 MVPs and leading the league in passing yards 4 times in his career, while also leading the Colts to 3 championships, including 1 Super Bowl back in 1970. Unitas marked the first great chapter in Colts football history and arguably the greatest era of Colts football ever, an era that was first marked by the greatest game ever played, as it's called, the 1958 NFL Championship, and then ushered in another era as the Colts moved into the Super Bowl era and made 2 NFL championships, or Super Bowls as they were called now, in 3 years. The first of them being one of the most historic upsets against the Colts in 1968, of course, that being Joe Namath's famous guarantee, and then winning the NFL championship in 1970 before Johnny Unitas would eventually leave the Colts for San Diego at the twilight of his career. And at number 1, do I really need to say it? It's one of the greatest quarterbacks and one of the greatest players in NFL history. That is going to be Peyton Manning. Although Manning didn't necessarily have the same success that Johnny Unitas had with the Colts or otherwise from an accolade standpoint or a championship standpoint, you have to take in consideration that Manning played at a time where he was playing against another all-time great in Tom Brady, who often hinders his chances of winning more Super Bowls and more accolades, whereas Unitas just didn't have that type of rival throughout his career. And in spite of this, Manning stood out statistically against all of his peers. He was an 8-time All-Pro in his career with the Colts. I'll say that again, 8-time All-Pro. That will not be done in the near future anytime soon by any other quarterback. He was a 2-time leader in passing yards, a 3-time leader in passing touchdowns, and was constantly putting up 4,000 passing yard seasons, which had never been done before in NFL history. He broke all the passing yards records early on in his career and consistently was putting up numbers after numbers in a season while becoming one of the winningest quarterbacks in NFL history. Manning did eventually win the Super Bowl in 2006, beating the Patriots along the way before also winning Super Bowl MVP honors. So the next time someone criticizes Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen about how they haven't won in the postseason, remind them of Peyton Manning and how he eventually became the greatest player in franchise history for a franchise that already has another all-time great at the position who has won more than Peyton Manning. And Manning has proven himself to be, again, one of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history and the greatest all-time Colt. So that's the overall list for the Indianapolis Colts and their top 10 according to myself. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section. Let me know your guys' overall top 10 for the Colts and any other team down the line that I'm going to be putting if you guys want to. And until next time, see you guys later.